In the darkest alleys of Nexus Prime, a wounded human rose against fate itself. He saved a princess, defied a syndicate, and caught the eye of a queen. This is where a legend is born. Nexus Prime never slept, but some corners of it wish they could. Daniel Davidson's boots scraped across the fractured pavement of the lower district, each step echoing with the weary rhythm of a man who had long since run out of places to run. Neon signs flickered overhead in sickly shades of blue and violent pink, their light washing across his scar-lined face and highlighting the permanence of grief etched into the lines around his eyes. It wasn't the kind of city that welcomed you. It was the kind that swallowed you, digested you, and spat out whatever pieces it didn't need. For 3 years, Dan had willingly offered himself to the process. 15 years as a Terran Special Operations captain had carved him into something sharp, something dangerous. But Nexus Prime didn't care. The galaxy didn't care. Not after Centauri, not after watching the people he loved burn while his own government called it acceptable loss. And so he'd walked away from his insignia, from his honor, from himself. Now he was just another human drifter in an alien megapolis, another shadow among millions. Another night in paradise, he muttered, pulling his weather-beaten jacket tighter around him as the never-ending drizzle descended, thin, cold, and persistent, like a memory you couldn't shake. He passed a holographic billboard cycling through advertisements for alien gambling dens, synthetic pleasure bars, and biotech dealers who would happily modify a man's DNA for the right price. Dan ignored it all. He'd learned how to be invisible in cities like this. Head down, shoulders forward, avoid eye contact with anything that had claws. The further he walked from Nexus Prime's entertainment district, the quieter the city became. The lights dimmed, the crowds thinned, and the air felt heavy with the kind of silence that warned seasoned soldiers something wasn't right. His instincts prickled, not loudly, but enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Then he heard it, a sound so small that 99% of Nexus Prime would have dismissed it. A muffled, trembling whimper. Dan stopped mid-step. His hand drifted beneath his jacket and closed around the grip of his illegal pulse pistol. Black market, unregistered, and purchased from someone who had thought Dan looked too tired to be dangerous. He scanned the narrow alley to his right, where the neon light died and only darkness lived. He saw 6 of them, tall, broad, draconian thugs, humanoid reptiles with scale-plated bodies built like armored tanks. They surrounded something pressed against the alley wall. Dan adjusted his angle, peering past their hulking frames. A flash of pink fabric, a thin, shaking shoulder, a child's frightened sob. His jaw tightened. He could walk away. Plenty of people did, but Dan wasn't built that way. "Hey," he barked, voice carrying the same command presence that once led elite soldiers into war zones. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" 6 reptilian heads snapped toward him, slit-pupiled eyes narrowing with annoyance and hunger. The largest of them stepped forward, serrated teeth gleaming under the dim lights. "Human," the leader hissed, voice like gravel scraped across metal. "This isn't your business." Dan ignored him. His focus shifted for a brief moment to the child, a small girl with delicate blue skin, silver hair tangled with dirt, and glowing eyes full of terror. Her dress was torn at the hem, her tiny hands pressed uselessly against the wall behind her. Those eyes were what did it. He'd seen enough kids in war zones, enough bodies, enough wasted innocence. "She's leaving with me," Gan said simply. "Walk away or bleed." The Draconians exchanged glances, then burst into rough, rumbling laughter. Dan didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink. The leader drew a serrated blade, long, curved, and wet-looking even in the dimness, as if hungry for the next wound it would carve. "Humans," he spat, "always thinking you're the toughest species in the galaxy." Dan sighed. He didn't waste breath replying. The first Draconian lunged. Dan moved, His elbow shot forward with practiced precision, slamming into the attacker's throat hard enough to collapse cartilage. The draconian choked, falling to its knees. Dan spun, catching another attacker by the wrist and wrenching it until bones snapped with a wet crack. Using the creature's momentum, he hurled the body into two others. The alley filled with snarls and the scraping of talons on wet pavement. Pain came quickly. Claws raked across Dan's back, sharp, slicing through jacket and skin alike. Hot blood spilled, but adrenaline kept him upright. He pivoted, driving a boot into another draconian's knee. It bent in the wrong direction with a crack like breaking tree bark. 3 down, 3 to go. Dan positioned himself in front of the girl, shielding her body with his own. "Run!" he yelled, not daring to take his eyes off the 2 remaining attackers. But she didn't move. Fear had frozen her in place. Then the blades came. Dan caught the first with his forearm, pain blooming but manageable. The second, he was a fraction too slow. The serrated edge plunged into his side. Fire tore through his torso. He gritted his teeth and held the attacker's wrist, keeping the blade in rather than letting the serration rip more flesh on the way out. With his free hand, Dan drove his thumb into the draconian's eye socket. It screamed, shrill, animalistic. The blade dropped. Dan wrenched it free from his own body and buried it in the throat of the next attacker in one fluid motion. Only the leader remained now, half blinded from Dan's earlier strike, blood spilling from a shattered eye. "You're dead, human," he snarled. "Boss Craig." Dan didn't let him finish. He lunged, his fist slamming into the creature's throat with enough force to break through its natural armor. The draconian collapsed, gasping for breath that never came. Silence. The rain pattered softly against metal, skin, and concrete. Dan staggered. He felt the wounds now, 8 in total, burning, bleeding, pulsing with pain. His vision blurred around the edges. He turned toward the girl. She stared at him as though he were some impossible being, a monster or a miracle. She couldn't decide which. "It's okay," Dan rasped, forcing his voice gentle despite the agony clawing up his ribs. I won't hurt you." He took one step forward. His knee buckled. He caught himself against the wall, breath coming shallow and ragged. His hand pressed to the worst of his wounds. Blood slipped between his fingers, warm and slick. The girl approached slowly. Her small blue hand reached out, touching his arm with surprising tenderness. "Thank you," she whispered. Perfect English, musical and strange. Dan tried to answer, but the world tilted sharply. Darkness tunneled in on him. The last thing he saw was the girl's glowing eyes hovering over him, and the pendant around her neck pulsing with a strange inner light. Then everything went black. Dan awoke the way soldiers often did, violently. His eyes snapped open. His breath hitched. His hand reached instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. Pain flared like a jagged lightning bolt across his torso, forcing a groan from his throat. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was alive or trapped inside one of the final hallucinations the brain conjures before shutting down for good. But then, details sharpened. A ceiling, his ceiling, the cracked light strip above his bed flickering with its usual temperamental hum, the faint scent of industrial cleaner mixed with metal and old rain, the familiar austerity of his apartment, sparse, utilitarian, organized with military precision. He was home, which made absolutely no sense. Dan pushed himself upright. A mistake. A spike of agony shot through his abdomen as his wounds protested violently. He hissed through his teeth, clutching his side. Only then did he notice the medical patches covering every injury. Not standard patches. These glowed faintly with blue biolight. Orion healing tech. Extremely advanced. Extremely expensive. Extremely illegal to own without diplomatic clearance. And very much not something a washed-up human merc could afford. His pulse quickened. Someone had been in his apartment. Someone with resources and access. His gaze swept the room again. Something else was off. His pulse pistol sat neatly on the nightstand. Dan never left it there. A soft chime echoed from the door. Dan froze. The chime sounded again, this time more insistent. He reached for the pistol, pulling it free with steadier hands than he expected. Adrenaline was a hell of a drug. Moving cautiously, he approached the door panel, ignoring the pain dragging across his ribs. His thumb hovered over the display as he activated the security screen. He stared. His blood went cold. 6 tall figures stood outside his door, immaculately arranged in 2 rows. Their armor glinted like polished moonstone, sleek ceremonial plating with glowing silver lines that traced along their shoulders and chest. Each bore the unmistakable insignia of the Orion Royal Guard: elite, deadly, unshakably loyal, and incredibly out of place on the doorstep of a nobody human mercenary. But they weren't the ones who stole his breath. Between them stood 2 figures. The small girl from the alley, cleaned, dressed in shimmering silver fabric, hair brushed until it looked like streams of moonlight. Her blue skin glowed faintly, her large, luminous eyes fixed on the door as if she could see through it. And beside her, Dan whispered, "Holy shit." A woman stepped slightly forward, as if sensing his awakening. Tall, taller than most humans, strikingly beautiful in a way that wasn't merely physical, but carried a gravity of presence. Her skin was a soft gradient of sky blue and luminescent silver, as if the color shifted subtly with every breath. Her snow-white hair cascaded over her shoulders in smooth waves, contrasting perfectly with the dark, form-fitting outfit she wore. Something like leather, but softer, sleeker, alien. Dan swallowed. His instincts told him to hide the weapon. His brain told him there was no point. His experience told him it was already too late. The chimes sounded a 3rd time. Screw it, he thought. He tucked the pistol into the back of his waistband, exhaled once, and pressed his palm to the door panel. The door slid open. Every emotion Dan had fought to bury for 3 years, fear, awe, curiosity, longing, pain, rose like a tide he couldn't stop. Up close, the Orion woman was even more breathtaking. Her eyes were the color of distant oceans, flecked with silver that shimmered when she moved. A small, knowing smile curved her lips as she took in his disheveled, shirtless, heavily bandaged appearance. "Daniel Davidson," she said, her voice melodic, layered with the gentle, harmonic undertone characteristic of her species. "Former captain of Terran's Special Operations, 7th Infiltration Unit, decorated 6 times for valor, presumed dead after the Centuri incident." Dan's jaw tightened. "You've got the wrong guy. Name's Dan Smith. Freelance security, nothing special." Her smile widened. "Of course," she said softly. "My mistake." She gestured gracefully to the girl. "I believe you've already met my daughter, Lavox." The child stepped forward, eyes luminous with a kind of pure admiration Dan had never seen directed at him. "You saved me," she whispered, "from the bad ones." Dan's expression softened, despite himself. "You're looking better, kid." He turned back to the mother. "Look, I appreciate the medical help, but you're gonna have to tell me what you really want." The Orion woman inclined her head slightly, an elegant gesture that somehow communicated both respect and authority. "May we come in, Captain? Some conversations," she added, "are best had in private." Dan hesitated. 6 elite guards, a royal-looking alien woman, a child he'd nearly died protecting. Yeah, privacy seemed like a good idea. He stepped aside. The woman entered, followed closely by Lavox. When the guards attempted to follow, the woman raised a hand, barely a motion, nothing more than a lift of her wrist. "Wait here," she commanded. Instant obedience. The guards snapped to attention, and then, unexpectedly, saluted Dan. He blinked. "Okay, that's new." The door slid shut. Dan turned toward his guests, pulse still unsteady. "You live simply," the woman observed, her eyes gliding across his sparse apartment. "For a man of your abilities." He ignored the jab. "Mind telling me who you are now?" The woman faced him fully, hands clasped loosely before her. I am Lady Ibarra, she said, royal consort to the High Chancellor of the Aryan hegemony. Dan froze. Ibarra? Royal consort? High-level political figure of one of the most powerful species in the galaxy? The room suddenly felt too small. She gestured toward the girl. And this is Princess Lavax, heir to the Orient throne. Dan blinked twice. He'd saved the equivalent of a galactic princess from street thugs. Great, fantastic, perfect, just what he needed. A full-blown political nightmare. That's unexpected, he managed. Ibarra smiled, warm, amused, and dangerously confident. Lava has a habit of wandering, a trait she inherited from me, I admit. Her expression hardened. You saved her life at great risk to your own. The hegemony owes you a debt. Dan shook his head immediately. I didn't know who she was. Anyone would have done the same. Ibarra stepped closer. Her scent, something like vanilla blended with an exotic spice he couldn't name, filled the space between them. No, she said quietly. Most would not. Her gaze held his, as if reading the scars beneath his skin. I have studied humans for many years, Captain Davidson. You are a species driven by moral courage. You fight for strangers. You sacrifice without hesitation. It is what makes your kind, a pause, remarkable. A heat moved through Dan's chest, one he wasn't expecting. Ibarra continued, therefore, I offer you a position as Princess Lavax's personal bodyguard. You would be compensated generously and granted diplomatic immunity across all hegemony space. Dan laughed once, humorless. Lady, you don't want me for anything official. I'm a problem magnet. That, she replied with a soft smirk, may be exactly why we do want you. Before Dan could respond, she added, 2 hours ago, the Draconian Syndicate discovered Lava's survival. Boss Crag will stop at nothing to reclaim her. And now, because you intervened, he has also placed a bounty on your head. Dan's pulse slowed, the kind of calm that only came when danger became absolute. He had history with the Syndicate, bad history, bloody history, the kind you didn't outrun. He sighed. All right, I'll escort you and the princess back to your embassy. We can discuss your job offer after that. Relief flickered across Ibarra's perfect features. A reasonable compromise. Dan moved to throw on a fresh shirt. As he peeled the fabric over his shoulders, Ibarra's gaze lingered on him longer than politeness required. Her eyes traced the defined musculature of his torso, the fresh wounds, the scars of old battles. Your species heals quickly, she murmured. One of our better qualities, Dan said, strapping a viro knife to his ankle. Along with being stubborn, Ibarra's smile returned, dangerous, knowing. I have observed many fascinating human qualities, she said, some far more compelling than stubbornness. Dan's heart kicked once, hard. He looked away. Bad idea, very bad idea. He didn't have room for that kind of complication. We should move, he said. Yes. Ibarra agreed softly, her eyes glinting. Before the Syndicate moves first. Lavax tugged on Dan's sleeve. I knew you'd help us, she said with total trust. Dan felt something tug sharply at a part of him he thought was dead. He forced himself to focus. Let's go. As they stepped out into the corridor, the Royal Guards snapped into formation. Their commander, a stern-faced male with tactical markings on his armor, approached. Captain Davidson, he said with surprising respect. Commander Thalos, my team is at your disposal. Dan frowned. They follow my lead? Thalos inclined his head. Lady Ibarra's direct order. Dan glanced at Ibarra. She lifted one elegant eyebrow as if daring him to question it. Something told him she enjoyed surprising him. And something else told him this night was only going to get worse. Or better. He wasn't sure which. The service corridors of Nexus Prime were never meant for royalty. They were cramped, dimly lit, and lined with exposed cables that crackled with unreliable energy. A thin mist drifted above the grated floor, carrying the metallic tang of coolant and the distant thrum of industrial machinery. But to Dan, they were familiar, comforting even. Places like this were where real work got done, where real danger hid and where real soldiers survived. "Stay close," he said, glancing over his shoulder at the small procession behind him. Princess Lavax clung to his sleeve with a quiet, steady trust that felt entirely too big for her small frame. Ibarra walked just beside her, elegant even in a narrow, rust-stained corridor, while the royal guards fanned out in a protective formation. Commander Thalos moved with rigid precision, but there was something in the way his eyes flicked down branching corridors that made Dan's instincts itch. Too cautious, too aware of routes Dan hadn't even briefed yet, as if the man already knew them. Dan filed the observation away. They reached a junction where the corridor split into three. Dan raised a fist, a silent signal, and the group halted immediately. Even the guards responded like trained infantry. "Interesting. The embassy is 10 blocks from here," Dan said, lowering his voice. "We'll use the maintenance tunnels. Less surveillance." "Those tunnels are mapped," Thalos said, tone clipped. "The syndicate may have access." Dan met his eyes. "Not all of them." A beat of silence. Then Ibarra's soft, intrigued voice. "You continue to surprise me, Captain." Dan didn't answer. He turned toward a narrow passage that looked like it dead-ended at a wall of storage crates. His steps echoed as he approached, each one measured with the certainty of someone who'd been here long before. Because he had. During the human-draconian conflict, Dan explained quietly, Terran intelligence carved covert pathways under Nexus Prime. Most were forgotten after the treaty. "And you just know where they are?" Thalos asked, skeptical. Dan shot him a look. "I helped design some of them." He stopped in front of a crate, ran his fingers along its surface, and pressed a small, nearly invisible indentation. A soft click echoed. A panel slid back, revealing a concealed biometric pad. Dan pressed his palm to it. The wall rumbled. Metal slid away, exposing a narrow entryway into complete darkness. Ibarra stepped forward, her eyes shimmering in the low light. "Your people hide many secrets." "You have no idea," Dan muttered. He moved first, leading the way into the darkness. The others followed, with Thalos positioned suspiciously close to Ibarra, as if trying to keep her within arm's reach. Dan noticed. He also noticed how Thalos's hand never drifted far from his weapon. The tunnel beyond was narrow, barely enough room for two abreast. The air smelled stale. Emergency lights flickered at random intervals, painting fleeting shadows across the group. Halfway through, Dan's instincts flared. He raised a closed fist. The group froze. "What is it?" Ibarra whispered. Dan listened. There, beneath the hum of distant machinery, footsteps. Multiple sets. Moving fast. Coordinated. "Contact incoming," he murmured. "We're being tracked." Thalos's hand flew to his weapon, but Dan held up a palm. "Lights off," Dan ordered. They obeyed. Everything plunged into near darkness. Only the faint glow from Lavax's pendant provided a pale, otherworldly illumination. "It's glowing again," Lava whispered. Ibarra touched her daughter's shoulder gently. "It reacts to danger, little one. Remember?" Dan blinked. "That pendant," he whispered. "It's tech? Orion Biobond Crystal," Ibarra said softly. "It strengthens when someone is emotionally connected to the wearer." Dan swallowed. Emotionally connected? To him? Already? He had no time to unpack the thought. The footsteps grew louder. Plasma fire erupted, bright streaks of burning blue slicing through the dark from both ends of the corridor. "Ambush!" Thalos roared. Two of the royal guards fell instantly, their armor sparking as the high-energy blasts overwhelmed their shields. Lava shrieked and clung to Dan's arm. Dan pushed her behind the nearest maintenance panel, shielding her with his body. "Stay down," he ordered. Then he turned, just in time to see Ibarra draw a sleek, alien pistol from the holster strapped to her thigh. She fired 3 shots. Perfect, precise, elegant. 3 syndicate mercenaries collapsed in the narrow corridor, smoke rising from their armor. Dan couldn't help it. Admiration flared through him like a lit fuse. "Remind me never to piss you off," he muttered. Ibarra's eyes glimmered. A wise choice. More fire came, heavy, forceful, coordinated. The syndicate was pressing from both sides, trying to choke them out. The remaining guards returned fire, creating a defensive line, but they were losing ground. The confined space was a death trap, and the syndicate knew it. "This isn't random," Dan said, mentally calculating angles, distances, weapons capabilities. They knew exactly where we'd be. Talos gritted his teeth. "Impossible. Only my—" Dan's stare cut sharp, deadly. "Only your team knew." Thalos stiffened, and Dan didn't miss the flicker, barely a twitch, of guilt or fear across the commander's face. Ibarra's voice cut in, crisp and commanding. "We move. Now." Dan cracked open a side panel. Rusted metal screeched softly. Behind it was another narrow shaft, older than the rest, nearly forgotten. "This wasn't on any map," Thalos said. "That's why it'll save us," Dan replied. He knelt, helping Lava climb in first. Then he turned to Ibarra. "You next." She hesitated. "And the rest of the guards?" "They hold the syndicate back long enough for us to escape," Dan said. "It's the only way." Ibarra stepped closer, eyes blazing. "I will not leave my people to die." "This isn't a debate," Dan growled, and for the first time his voice cracked. Not with anger, but with something deeper. "They want lava. They'll tear through us unless someone buys time." Ibarra stared at him, really stared, seeing the weight he carried, the exhaustion, the relentless instinct to put himself in front of every danger. "You misunderstand," she whispered, stepping into his space. "I am not refusing because of pride, but because I need you, Daniel." Her fingers brushed his arm, light but electric. "The files on Centauri," she murmured, "are locked behind biometric systems. Only I can access them, and I will." That made him freeze. Centauri, his squad, the truth he'd never stop chasing. He swallowed. Lava's voice trembled from inside the shaft. "Please, hurry." The guards were losing ground. Plasma fire ricocheted around them. Dan made his choice. "You first," he said quietly. Ibarra slid into the shaft, graceful, even in urgency. Dan followed, sealing the panel behind them. The darkness returned, thick and heavy. The only sound was their breath and the scraping of knees against metal as they crawled through the narrow passage. "This leads to an abandoned maintenance hub," Dan explained softly. "From there, we can reroute to the diplomatic quarter." Ibarra's voice floated back to him. "Your resourcefulness continues to impress." Dan huffed. "Not resourceful, just stubborn." "Humans," Ibarra murmured, "are rarely just one thing." They crawled for 10 minutes before emerging into a dusty chamber filled with defunct machinery and flickering orange lamps. The space felt quiet, safe for the moment. Dan helped Ibarra to her feet, his hands perhaps lingering longer than necessary at her waist. Her body pressed slightly against his, and for a moment the air between them felt charged again. "Thank you," she said softly. Dan cleared his throat, stepping back. "We're not out yet." Lava rushed into her mother's arms, trembling but brave. "Are the bad people gone?" "For now," Dan said, "but we need to keep moving." As they crossed the room, the child tugged Dan's sleeve again. "I saw you," she whispered, "before it happened. I saw you coming to help me." Dan frowned. "You followed me?" Ibarra offered a weary smile. "Lava has rare abilities, fragments of precognition." Dan blinked. "That's a thing?" "For my people, yes. Rare, but real." Lava nodded. "I knew you would save me." Something inside Dan shifted, an ache he hadn't felt in years. They reached the maintenance exit. Dan pressed his ear to the door. Silence. He eased it open and froze. The diplomatic quarter loomed just beyond, but something was wrong. "What is it?" Ibarra asked. Dan pointed. "Security protocols are offline." Ibarra paled, her skin shimmering with a silvery undertone. "Impossible. The embassy's defenses don't fail." "Unless someone shut them down from the inside," Dan said grimly. Her eyes darkened. "The High Chancellor's Chief of Security, Vorin, he has been pushing for cooperation with the Draconian Syndicate. I thought it was posturing, but now," Dan finished, "you're not so sure." The realization hung heavy. Dangerous. We need a safe house, Ibarra said quietly. Somewhere off-grid. Dan nodded. You know a place? Yes, she said. An abandoned cultural exchange center in the Human District. I maintained it for my research. Dan raised a brow. A royal consort with a secret hideout? Do you judge me? She asked softly. Dan's lips twitched. Not at all. But before they could move, he paused. Ibarra, he said, before we walk into another trap, we need proof. He pulled a small, illegal scanning device from his pocket. Ibarra blinked. That is forbidden tech. Good thing I'm not exactly law-abiding, Dan replied. He connected the scanner to the embassy's dormant security feed. When the image popped onto the screen, Ibarra sucked in a breath. Vorin stood in a secure meeting room alongside Commander Thalos, and across from them was Boss Crag, smirking, alive, free, planning. Dan's voice dropped to a growl. So that's who we're up against. Ibarra whispered the single word that changed everything. Treason. For a long moment, no one spoke. The projection from Dan's illegal scanner flickered against the dark walls of the maintenance chamber like a cruel joke. Vorin, the High Chancellor's own chief of security, standing shoulder to shoulder with Boss Crag. Commander Thalos, very much alive, no signs of battle, no hint of distress. A traitor revealed with the casual indifference of someone who had never truly been loyal. Craig leaned forward in the embassy conference room, talons tapping against the table. It was a meeting of conspirators, and the realization hit Ibarra with a visible shock. Her luminescent skin dimmed slightly, the color cooling as if drowning in mist. Vorin, she whispered, voice barely audible. He helped raise lava. He oversaw her protection from infancy. Dan cut in gently but firmly. He sold her out. Ibarra closed her eyes. It wasn't weakness. It was a queen grieving the betrayal of her own court. Lava moved closer to her mother, gripping her hand. Mama? She asked softly. Ibarra forced a smile, bending to kiss her daughter's forehead. You are safe, little one. I promise. When she rose again, her expression startled Dan. A blend of heartbreak, fury, and raw, regal power. He had seen commanders lose soldiers. He had seen generals learn their governments had betrayed them. But he had never seen a queen learn her court had attempted to murder her child. It changed her. She looked up at Dan. We need to move. Now, he nodded. To your safe house. Ibarra took Lava's hand, and the three of them began navigating the maintenance corridors again. Quicker this time, urgency pushing them forward. The safe house. The Human District was quieter than the rest of Nexus Prime. Forgotten corners, boarded-up shops, flickering neon signs advertising businesses long dead. The building they approached looked like a relic from another age. Faded lettering reading Earth Orion Cultural Exchange Center. Its walls stained with decades of grime. You're sure about this place? Dan asked. Ibarra pressed her palm to a concealed plate on the wall. This building was abandoned after the war. Only I had access. Mechanical locks clicked. The door slid open to reveal an interior that looked nothing like the ruin outside. The inside was spacious, polished, clean, almost museum-like. Human sculptures stood beside Orion artifacts. Data screens lined the walls, dormant but waiting. The air smelled faintly of ceremonial incense mixed with metallic Orion technology. Dan stepped in behind them, scanning every corner out of habit. Not bad. A little fancy for a hideout. Ibarra arched a brow. Would you prefer a bunker? He shrugged. Wouldn't say no. Lava climbed onto a cushioned seat and curled up, exhaustion beginning to weigh on her small frame. Ibarra stroked her daughter's hair, humming softly in the harmonic way only Orions could. Dan found himself watching them longer than he intended. She noticed. You are staring, she said, a teasing softness in her tone. Dan cleared his throat. Just making sure she's all right. But that wasn't the truth. Not entirely. Hibera's presence filled the room differently than anyone else's. Warm, commanding, and strangely comforting. She was royalty, but she didn't feel untouchable. She felt Real. She stood, gesturing toward an adjoining chamber. We should talk. Alone. Dan followed. The truth of Centuri. Lady Ibarra's personal study was smaller, more intimate. A curved desk, soft lights, and a wall of inactive screens. She moved with fluid grace as she approached the desk and activated a biometric console. Computer, she commanded, voice lower than before. Authorization, Lady Ibarra Vax, Royal Protocol 793. The screens ignited in cascading layers of light. And then, file after classified file appeared, stamped with both Aryan high security and Terran Black Ops seals. Dan stiffened. This is restricted intelligence, he said darkly. High level. Not even special operations had access to this. Ibarra met his gaze. Exactly, she gestured toward the files. 3 years ago, your squad was sent to Centuri 4 under the guise of investigating weapons smuggling. She tapped a file, bringing up schematics and communications logs. You were told the risk level was low. Dan's jaw tightened. We were lied to. Yes, she said softly. Terran High Command already knew what you would find. She opened another file. A draconian bioweapons facility. Data flashed across the screen. Virus genomes, test maps, targeted DNA markers. Dan's breath left him. That's human DNA, he whispered. Engineered to target your species, Ibarra confirmed. A genocide weapon. Dan felt sick. His squad had stumbled onto a genocide weapon, and High Command sent us anyway, he murmured. Yes, Ibarra's expression turned grim. Because some among your High Command were compromised. She opened personnel images, Terran leaders, political figures, military generals. Files stamped with horrifying words. Infiltrated, blackmailed, replaced. Replaced? Dan echoed. Ibarra nodded. Draconian infiltrators, surgically altered to mimic Terrans. Dan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. They sent your squad in, Ibarra continued, with the intent that none of you would return. You were getting too close to exposing the infiltration. Eliminating you and blaming us was the cleanest solution. Dan clenched his fists. So they bombed the facility, he said, voice cracking. With us still inside. Ibarra nodded sadly. And framed your people for civilian casualties to ignite distrust between our species. She tapped the final file. Footage. From inside the facility, Dan watched as he and his squad evacuated civilians, terrified alien families, injured workers, children. He saw himself dragging a wounded scientist through a collapsing corridor. He saw his people saving lives in a place they had been told was a den of criminals. He watched the moment the bombs fell, his squad disappearing in flame, and himself being thrown against a blast shield. Dan covered his mouth. His breaths came ragged, uneven. I carried the guilt of those civilians for 3 years, he whispered. I thought we killed them. Ibarra's hand rested gently on his forearm. You saved over 300, she said softly. You were heroes, and your government made you villains. Dan's throat tightened. Why are you showing me this? He demanded, voice rough. Why risk everything? Ibarra stepped closer. Because the same conspiracy that killed your squad now hunts my daughter, she said. And because... She hesitated. Then her voice softened to something intimate, almost fragile. Because I have watched you, Daniel Davidson, and I have never encountered a warrior like you. His breath caught. What does that mean? Ibarra reached up, fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. A delicate, deliberate touch. It means I recognize your fire, she whispered. Your honor, your grief, your strength. Dan swallowed. Ibarra. Her eyes burned into his. Among my people, when two souls resonate, we do not ignore it. The room felt too small, too still. Dan didn't move. Couldn't. Then her hands slid to the back of his neck, and she kissed him. Soft at first, testing, questioning, but Dan responded with a hunger he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Her lips were warm, sweet, edged with a faint taste of alien citrus. Her fingers slid into his hair. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer. She pressed against him, body lithe and cool and impossibly soft. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Ibarra rested her forehead against his. "I wanted to do that," she said, voice husky, "since the moment I saw you." Dan huffed a shaky laugh. "Even with all these wounds," she smiled, "especially because of them. 8 stab wounds to save a child. Such beautiful human recklessness." He kissed her again, deeper, needier. She responded in kind. They barely made it to the adjoining room before lips and hands became frantic. Clothes came undone, and the world outside ceased to exist. For a moment, there was no conspiracy, no syndicate, no betrayal. Only 2 warriors finding something neither had expected, a reason to breathe again. The interrupted moment. They lay together afterward in the dim light, Ibarra's head resting on Dan's shoulder, his hand tracing lazy patterns across her cool, silken skin. She looked peaceful in a way Dan doubted many had ever seen. "I never expected this," he admitted quietly. "What?" she asked with a teasing smile. "Finding yourself in bed with an alien royal?" He laughed softly. "Finding myself caring. After Centauri, I shut everything down." Ibarra lifted herself slightly, her fingers brushing his cheek with tenderness. "And now?" Dan met her gaze. "Now, I have something worth fighting for." Ibarra's eyes softened, then sharpened in alarm as a voice crackled through the intercom. "Dan! Ibarra!" Maya's voice, urgent, frantic. "Movement! Draconian forces sweeping the district. They're searching door by door." Dan and Ibarra exchanged a look, raw emotion fading instantly into warrior focus. Time to fight again. Ibarra slid from the bed, her movements fluid and precise. Dan followed, pulling on his gear despite the lingering ache of his wounds. Ibarra's voice was cool steel. "Then we move. We show them what happens when they threaten my daughter, and the man who took 8 stabs to save her." Dan smirked, chambering a round into his pulse pistol. "Let's give them hell." And together they stepped into the war, waiting outside. Outside the safe house, Nexus Prime shifted into night cycle. Artificial darkness rolled over the city like a slow-moving storm, neon lights flickering to life 1 block at a time. But in the human district, the lights struggled. Many dead, many broken, leaving long stretches of street swallowed in shadow. Inside, however, the safe house pulsed with preparation. Weapons laid out, holographic projectors warmed to life. Professor Terran adjusted devices with trembling, careful fingers. Maya monitored scanners while occasionally suppressing a shiver, her altered veins glowing faintly beneath her skin like traces of blue fire. Dan paced. He didn't like the plan. It was risky, reckless, and hinged entirely on manipulating a crime lord known for brutality and unpredictability. But it was the only way. Ibarra stepped beside him, fastening the last clasp on her sleek combat attire. Somehow, even armored, she looked regal, a queen ready to go to war. "You're tense," she observed. "Because this is insane," Dan replied bluntly. "We're using a princess as bait, not—" Dan pointed at her. "That's what I said. Kind of." Ibarra. At that moment, Lava's small voice floated from the concealed stairway leading to the underground panic room. "Mom?" Ibarra immediately knelt before her daughter. "You must stay here, little one." Lava nodded solemnly. "I know, but I saw something." Her glowing eyes flicked toward Dan. "The human will protect us." Dan felt something strange flicker in his chest, equal parts pride and fear. "I will," he promised quietly. "Count on it." Lava smiled, a small, brave smile, and descended into the panic room. Ibarra sealed the door with a palm scan. The reinforced plates slid into place, glowing with layered Orion locks. Only then did Dan turn to Ibarra. "You sure she'll be okay down there?" Ibarra faced him with absolute certainty. "With you above her? Yes." That certainty tightened something in Dan's chest again. He forced himself to focus. "Let's run through the plan." The plan, simple, deadly, beautiful. Professor Terran activated the holographic projector nestled in the center of the room. Light shimmered, weaving itself into the image of Princess Lavox. The projection breathed, blinked, shifted nervously. Biosignatures radiated from her, indistinguishable from the real thing. Dan let out a low whistle. That's good, creepy good. Terran glanced up nervously. Indistinguishable to even advanced scanners. But it drains power. We must time it precisely. Maya stepped forward, projecting a map of the building onto the wall. We'll trigger a false security breach, just enough to show lava on internal surveillance, enough for the draconian hunters scanning for anomalies. And Craig will come himself, Dan added. He wants the prize delivered on a silver plate. Ibarra nodded. Craig's thirst for power is his weakness. Dan cracked his knuckles. Mine too, probably. But at least I'm fun at parties. Maya stared at him. How are you like this? Human coping mechanisms, Dan explained. We joke before inevitable doom. It's tradition. Ibarra shot him a subtle smile, one that warmed more than it should have. Then, in unspoken synchronization, the team moved. The safe house transformed into a trap. Terran reconfigured the internal security system, tuning it to detect and disable draconian biosignatures. Maya set her stolen syndicate codes to forward the evidence package to Terran and Orion authorities once the operation began. Ibarra prepared her disruptor, a device designed specifically to shatter Craig's personal shielding, and Dan assembled his weapons: pulse pistol, Vero knife, stun mines, concussion rounds. The final piece was the holographic lava, who now sat trembling on a couch like real prey. Dan crouched to eye level with the image, studying it critically. She looks scared, he said. Good. Craig likes his victims scared. That is deeply disturbing, Terran murmured. Dan shrugged. You get used to the psychology of monsters. Maya suddenly tensed, eyes flicking to a scanner. They're coming. Everyone froze. How many? Dan asked. Multiple signatures. Heavy armor, high-speed approach. I see. At least 20. Dan nodded once, his body shifting instantly into combat mode. The ache of his half-healed wounds faded beneath the rush of adrenaline. Positions. The lights dimmed. They waited. The attack. The first explosion shook the building. Dust rained from the ceiling as a shockwave rattled the reinforced structure. Another blast came almost immediately after. Draconian breaching charges, powerful enough to rip through normal walls. Right on schedule, Dan muttered. Ibarra slid into her concealed firing position above the entrance. Maya retreated to her console. Terran hid behind an overturned table, clutching his data pads like they were holy artifacts. Dan stepped into the central room, standing protectively in front of the holographic princess. Craig wanted a show. Dan would give him one. A thunderous crash echoed. The main entrance blew inward, metal and smoke spiraling out as two draconian shock troopers charged inside. Their armor glowed red-hot from the explosive breach, plasma rifles raised. Behind them, Craig, nearly 7 feet tall, scars across his scaled face forming twisted ridges. His eyes gleamed with predatory hunger. He saw the holographic lava. He smiled. There you are, little prize, he growled, and the human fool who thought he could cross me. Dan smiled back. Hey, Craig, you look smaller than I remember. Bad diet? The crime lord snarled. Kill him! The first volley of plasma fire erupted, violent, explosive. Dan dove behind an overturned couch, returning fire with precise bursts. The projector shielded itself with automated reflexes, keeping the illusion of lava intact. Craig advanced, shield flaring to life, a shimmering blue field that turned Dan's shots into harmless sparks. Perfect. Dan pressed his communicator. Ibarra, now, above. Lady Ibarra rose like a shadow given form. Her disruptor hummed. She fired. A piercing pulse of concentrated energy hit Craig directly. His shield flickered, destabilized, then shattered in a burst of blue shards. Craig roared. Dan surged from cover. He slammed into the crime lord with full force, driving him back into a metal support pillar. The impact shook the room. Craig recovered fast, claws slashing, one razor-sharp talon catching Dan across the cheek and drawing blood in a harsh red streak. Dan didn't flinch. He drove his knee into Craig's gut, grabbed one of the alien's arms, twisted hard, and forced the crime lord to the ground. Craig bucked like a beast, trying to throw Dan off, but Dan struck the sensitive nerve cluster at the base of the draconian's throat, exactly where he aimed to. Craig went rigid. Dan slapped restraints onto his wrists. He leaned close, breath ragged. That's for the 8 stab wounds. Before Craig could respond, the floor shockwave triggered, the modified security system activating. A blast of electric pulses surged through the lower level, targeting the draconian biosignatures. The shock troopers collapsed, weapons clattering to the ground. Maya shouted from the console, "Transmission complete. Evidence sent to both governments." Professor Terran crawled out from cover, panting. "I've received confirmation from loyal Orion forces. They've raided the border facility. The bioweapon project is finished." Craig's eyes widened in horror. "No," he hissed. "You can't." Dan hauled him upright. "Save it for the tribunal. You're done." Ibarra approached slowly, each step radiating queenly wrath. "Boss Craig," she declared, voice ringing with authority and fury. "By decree of the Orion hegemony, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, attempted kidnapping of royal blood, and the creation of bioweapons." Craig spat at her feet. "You've won nothing," he growled. "Oh, I think we have," Dan said. And then a sharp click sounded from behind. Everyone turned. Commander Thalos stood in the ruined doorway, armor cracked, helmet off, face twisted in cold resolve. A pistol was aimed directly at Dan's head. "You weren't supposed to survive," Thalos said quietly. Dan raised a brow. "Let me guess. You're here to surrender peacefully?" Thalos fired. Dan moved. The shot missed, slamming into the far wall. Thalos aimed again, and Ibarra shot first. Her blast struck his weapon, sending it spinning across the floor. Thalos staggered, clutching his scorched hand. "You betrayed the High Chancellor," Ibarra said, her voice trembling with fury. "You betrayed my daughter." Thalos sneered. "I did what was necessary. The Syndicate offered a future where we would rule, together. You were too blind to see it." Dan stepped forward. "You're done." Thalos reached for a hidden knife. Dan lunged, disarming him and slamming him into the floor with a force that left the traitor gasping. Thalos didn't get back up. Not dead, just unconscious. Ibarra lowered her weapon slowly, breathing hard. Dan met her eyes. "It's over," he said. She exhaled. "No, this was only the beginning." But for the first time since Centauri, Dan felt the tide turning, and he wasn't fighting alone. The hours after Craig's capture unfolded like a controlled collapse, fast, loud, and irreversible. The safe house, once a hidden sanctuary, now pulsed with activity. Loyal Orion forces stormed the district, escorting survivors, securing the perimeter, and placing both Craig and Thalos into containment units, shielded with dampening fields strong enough to hold a small star. Terran intelligence, uncorrupted Terran intelligence, arrived soon after, their muted expressions revealing deep shock at the evidence Maya had transmitted. Some saluted Dan the moment they saw him. Others bowed their heads in shame. All of them knew this was a reckoning years overdue. But Dan didn't care about the politics, not yet. He only cared about finding Ibarra and her daughter. Once Craig was secured, Dan slipped away from the crowd and climbed the stairs to the rooftop. He found Ibarra there, silhouetted against the city's false dawn. Nexus Prime was beginning its day cycle, bathing the skyline in soft, shimmering blue light that mirrored the hues of her skin. She stood with her back to him, posture straight, regal, but tired. Dan stepped beside her. "City looks different from up here," he said softly. Ibarra did not look away from the horizon. "It looks safe, for the first time in many years." Dan followed her gaze. Smoke still rose from distant rooftops. Drones flickered across the sky. Sirens echoed faintly. Safe wasn't the word he'd use, but he understood what she meant. "It's over," Dan said quietly. "No," she murmured, finally turning toward him. "It is just beginning." Her eyes held something he'd only seen once before, in the quiet after their battle, when she had finally let herself breathe. Hope. Dan found himself stepping closer without realizing it. "What happens now?" "The High Chancellor has summoned you to the Royal Palace," Ibarra said, "to thank you, formally, for saving Princess Lavax, and for revealing a conspiracy that endangered 2 species." Dan winced. "I'm still technically a deserter, you know." Ibarra's lips curved upward. "Not anymore." Dan blinked. "What?" She reached into her belt pouch and handed him a datapad. "Your name has been cleared," she said. "The evidence Maya transmitted includes proof of your innocence, and the innocence of your entire squad." Dan stared at the device as if it were a ghost from his past. His squad, his brothers, his dead. Cleared. He swallowed hard, emotions gathering in his chest like a storm. His voice broke. "I thought I'd carry that stain forever." Ibarra touched his cheek gently. "You carry scars, Dan, but you do not carry guilt. Not anymore." He took a deep breath, the air suddenly feeling sharp in his lungs. For the first time in 3 years, he felt light. "I don't know what to say." Ibarra took his hand. "Then don't. Just come with me. Let the Chancellor thank you properly. And afterward, if you accept, your new life begins." "My new life?" Dan echoed. "The position of Princess Lavax's personal protector," Ibarra said, eyes warm. "Lava insists she wants no one else." Dan felt something melt inside him. "Just Lava?" A slow, dangerous smile touched Ibarra's lips. "Well," she murmured, "her mother may have similar requirements." Dan laughed, a real laugh, from the chest, not the bitter ones he'd used to hide behind. "I think I can manage that." Ibarra squeezed his hand, then led him back inside. The Palace of Stars. 2 weeks later, Daniel Davidson stood in the grand hall of the Azurian Royal Palace, an impossibly vast chamber carved of crystalline stone that glowed with its own soft light. Columns rose like frozen waterfalls. Banners of silver and deep blue fluttered from above, embroidered with the crest of the hegemony. Hundreds of dignitaries, military leaders, scientists, and diplomats filled the hall. And every single one of them stood as Dan entered. He wore a Terran dress uniform, fresh, formal, uncomfortable. He preferred tactical gear, but today was not a day for armor. Maya stood beside him, transformed from hunted ghost to honored survivor. Her altered veins had stabilized thanks to Orion medical care, and she carried herself with newfound strength. Behind them were the surviving members of Dan's squad, men and women once thought dead or traitors, now restored to honor. Their presence filled Dan with pride he had feared he'd never feel again. A ceremonial chime rang. The High Chancellor rose, a tall figure draped in shimmering robes, with eyes like polished obsidian and an aura of ancient authority. He raised his hands for silence. "Captain Daniel Davidson," he intoned, "step forward." Dan obeyed. The hall fell into absolute stillness. "For your courage," the Chancellor continued, "in saving Princess Lavax, heir to the Orion throne, for your pivotal role in uncovering the conspiracy that threatened the hegemony and your own people, and for taking 8 stab wounds to protect a child you did not know." He lifted a gleaming medallion shaped like a star with a sapphire core. "We bestow upon you the Order of the Azure Star, the highest honor we can grant a non-Orion." The medallion settled against Dan's chest. A thunderous wave of applause erupted around him. Dan's eyes drifted to the front row. Princess Lavax sat proudly, practically glowing with joy. When their eyes met, she gave him a small salute, awkward but adorable. Beside her sat Ibarra, radiant in formal regalia that was somehow both dignified and heartbreakingly beautiful. Her gaze held warmth and promise. Dan bowed his head, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had come here a broken soldier. Now he stood, a hero reborn. The reception, A future opened. Hours later, crystal lights dimmed for the royal reception. Soft music filled the air. Orion harmonics blended with Terran orchestral themes in a surprisingly perfect fusion. Dan lingered near a window, watching distant starships ascend through the palace's force field. He still wasn't used to the idea of being welcome anywhere, let alone in a palace. "You are hiding," a familiar voice teased. Dan turned. Ibarra stood behind him, glass in hand, looking at him as though the rest of the room didn't exist. Her dress was a cascade of silver threads, interwoven with deep midnight hues, shimmering with each breath. "You clean up well," Dan admitted. "And you," Ibarra said, stepping closer, "look uncomfortable." "Is it that obvious?" She laughed softly, a sound that made something deep in Dan warm. "Father wishes to speak with you," she said. "Your father?" Dan echoed. "The High Chancellor?" "Yes, though do not fear. He has already approved of us." Dan blinked. "Us?" Ibarra arched an elegant brow. "Did you think I would keep my affection hidden from my own family?" "Well," Dan muttered, "yes, because you're—" He gestured vaguely. "You. And you are you," she said simply. "Strength recognizes strength." They walked together to the Chancellor, who studied Dan with an inscrutable but not hostile gaze. "So," the Chancellor said, "you are the human who has stolen my daughter's heart." Dan nearly choked. The Chancellor laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. "Relax, Captain. Azurians value courage, loyalty, and passion. You have shown all three." Then, with a mischievous glint, "And I admit I look forward to grandchildren with your robust Terran traits." Dan choked again. Ibarra's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Father, you are going to kill him." "I would prefer not to," the Chancellor said lightly. "He is useful." Dan rubbed a hand over his face. "This is a lot." Ibarra slipped her fingers into his, grounding him instantly. "One step at a time, Daniel." He squeezed her hand gently. "One step at a time." The dance. Later, when the hall lights shifted into soft blues and silvers, Ibarra pulled Dan toward the dance floor. "I don't dance," he warned. "You fight entire armies," she said. "You can handle a slow dance." She placed his hands around her waist, her own hands resting lightly on his shoulders. They moved slowly, the world narrowing until only the two of them remained. "You know," Dan murmured, "if someone told me a month ago that I'd be dancing with an alien queen in a palace—" "I am not a queen," she corrected with a smile. "A royal consort. But I admit the distinction is negotiable." Dan laughed. "Of course it is." Her expression softened. "You are different when you laugh. Brighter." "Maybe I finally have something to laugh about." Ibarra leaned closer, her forehead resting against his. "And something to live for." Dan's heart clenched. He didn't kiss her. She kissed him first. Again. Epilogue. The seed of a new war. Much later, after the reception faded into quiet corridors, Dan stood on a balcony overlooking the night-lit city. Ibarra joined him silently, wrapping her arms around his waist as she leaned into him. "Do you think this peace will last?" he asked. She rested her chin on his shoulder. "Long enough to matter." He kissed her head softly. "That's vague." "Diplomatic answer," she said. "You will get used to those." But Dan wasn't listening anymore, because someone was approaching. A Terran official, tall, sharp-eyed, wearing the insignia of the newly reformed Terran Intelligence Network. "Captain Davidson," the man said, "may we speak?" Dan gently detached from Ibarra and faced him. "What's going on?" The man paused, then handed Dan a sealed data packet. "A message," he said grimly, "from an anonymous whistleblower in deep cover." Dan opened it. The display flickered. Words appeared. "Centuri was only the beginning. The infiltration runs deeper. Prepare yourself." Dan stared at the message. Then the official added, "There's more. They requested you specifically." Ibarra stepped forward. "What does that mean?" Dan exhaled slowly. "It means," he said, "our fight isn't over." A slow, fierce smile spread across Ibarra's lips. "Good," she whispered. I would hate for our story to end so soon. Dan took her hand. Together, they turned toward the city. A soldier reborn, a royal consort unbound, a child who saw the future, and a war waiting in the shadows. The legend of Daniel Davidson had only just begun.